This is a short lecture on James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. I opted to upload this lecture after you'd finished this reading because I really wanted all of you to kind of read both of these kind of historic figures' speeches or writings and come to some conclusions on your own and to really think through what their words meant in the sort of contemporary moment. So, if you weren't already familiar with James Baldwin, he, quite honestly, is one of the most prolific writers, of the 20th century, who really talked a lot about race and race relations, and focused on the meanings of what it meant to be kind of in the civil rights movement. Here you see just a few pictures of him that I pulled from the web. And what I would also tell you that I think you should do is to simply go on YouTube and to type in James Baldwin and to listen to some of his speeches because he, quite honestly, is a very phenomenal speaker. And as you listen to him, particularly if you're not paying attention to the black and white video, you'll find that he could be talking about today. Um, as you see here in this top right picture, he's pictured with Sammy Davis Jr. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He is, I chose the bottom right hand picture because he was such a prolific writer. And then of course, on the left hand side here, he has so many amazing quotes that I think are really inspirational, of which this is one where he says, "Love takes off the mask that we fear we cannot live without, and know we cannot live within." I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. So here he asks us to sort of expand our sort of contemporary understandings of these words. James Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924, and died on December 1st, 1987. As I noted previously, he's a prolific writer of novels, poetry, short stories, plays, and essays, as well as being a very active civil rights activist during the 50s and 60s. He was born in Harlem, New York. His early writings and essays were published in his 1955 book, Notes of a Native Son. And in 1948, I think it's important to note before his first sort of major writings were published, he was disgusted by the amount of prejudice against both blacks and homosexuals in the United States. And he left the United States and moved to Paris in his mid 20s, where he would spend virtually the rest of his life. For those of you guys who didn't know, particularly for African Americans, during the sort of 1920s to the 1960s, really, Paris really became a kind of a sanctuary of sorts, particularly for African Americans. You have a lot of different artists of the Harlem Renaissance who took refuge in Paris because they were so much more accepting of African Americans, as well as being so much more accepting of those who identified as gay or lesbian, as and James Baldwin being both gay as well as an African American man. He felt he was more accepted in Paris, and although he continued to do a lot of work in the United States to advocate for civil rights. In 1957, he returned to the United States to participate in the civil rights movement alongside both Dr. King and Malcolm X. And in 1961, he published an important essay on race relations and the role of writers in society entitled Nobody Knows My Name, More Notes of a Native Son, which would be followed in 1962 by the novel Another Country. Soon after, in 1963, he would publish The Fire Next Time. Arguably, that last book, The Fire Next Time, has been one of the most influential literature pieces on race relations. And if you haven't read it or even read sections of it, I highly recommend that you take a look at it because really, when you read it, there are ways in which he still speaks to so much of what's going on today. There's so many different quotes by James Baldwin that really speak to race relations. And so I've just selected kind of a handful that stood out to me But again, I invite you to do your own research on a man like James Baldwin. So, for example, he said, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all of the time. I want you to think about what a quote like that means. That if you're conscious, it also means that you have that you are also in rage almost all the time. That is, in some ways, that speaks to the both the treatment of African Americans historically, but that if you're conscious of what's going on to African American communities, it becomes equally important to understand why people are angered. I think this particular quote speaks to things like Black Lives Matter. For those, maybe those of you guys who caught Jesse Williams' speech on the BET Awards, you'll understand that that's where that anger comes from. And we'll talk about this a lot more as we move forward in class. He also says that I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. I think that this is one of the things that we're going to get at in this class, that I want us to be able to distinguish discourse from fact. And one of the things that we come across in the contemporary moment is that there are many people who believe that citizenship or being a member of this country means that that individuals uh, should be all accepting of the United States and its policy positions, its laws, its rules, its culture. But some would argue, and I think this is what Baldwin is getting at, is that true freedom means that not only that at times you may be accepting of some policies, but you also have the right to critique it and ask for change. And I think that's a really important thing to grasp, particularly as we move forward in talking about race relations in this country. That there's a level at which some people, don't want to focus on it, who are actually saying why race shouldn't matter. While for others, and I would be in this camp, argue we need to pay greater attention to the types of disparities that do exist so that we can create true change. And then finally, he says people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. So part of this is really kind of talking about the fact that the relationships that we see today are very much sort of historically structured. And so this creates a very kind of set of complicated relationships structurally that we also constantly have to negotiate. So a few notes on Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde really worked did a lot of her work in the 1970s, and in some of the pictures here, you get to see the fact that not only is she African American, but she is also a feminist. She is known for her prolific writing and poetry and literature. I chose a few of these pictures because obviously, on the right hand side, you see the kind of research and work that she did. And on the left, I think, are some very powerful images of her as a feminist, where in that bottom left hand corner says, women are powerful and dangerous, talking to the ways in which the women can be, strong women in particular, can be viewed as a threat. And in that top left is probably one of her most well-known quotes where she says, when I dare to be powerful and use my strengths in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid. And part of what makes Audre Lorde really significant from a historical standpoint is she was unafraid to challenge the status quo. She identifies as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. These are her own words. Some of this you should have gathered from the readings that were assigned. Excuse me. Audre Lorde dedicated both of her life and her creative talent to confronting and addressing the injustice of racism, sexism, and homophobia. She believed in what we call intersectionality, and this is a theory that I'm going to get to a little bit later in class. But at its core, it means that we can't just say that we're only about race, or we're only about our sexuality, or we're only about our gender. That in order to truly understand a human being, we need to understand the sort of intersections of the different axes of difference. Lorde's love poems compose much of her earliest work. Her experiences of civil unrest during the 1960s, along with her sexuality, created a rapid shift to more political statements. So basically, later in her career, is when she really began to write a lot of her more politicized work, which I think is embodied in that commencement speech that you had to read. So a few quotes that I thought were significant that I pulled out, but again, she's another writer and speaker that I think you should consider doing more reading on. In particular, she's another person I would go onto YouTube and just listen to some of what she had to say. But here are a few quotes that I thought were important. It's not our differences that divide us; it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. In many ways, that first quote really captures the themes of this class. And this next quote is probably the most famous quote that she has. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game. They will, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all of our lives in this place and time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. See whose face it wears. Then the personal, as the political, can begin to illuminate all our choices. So, a few different things. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In other words, part of what she gets at in this quote is that a lot of times we are encouraged to just play the game, to do the status quo, to do what's expected of us. And part of what she argues here is that if we fall into that line of thinking, is that oftentimes we reproduce inequalities. Um, that instead we need to be able to think outside the box in order to address and create social change. Um, she also encourages self reflection about where we stand and how we situate ourselves in relationship to power. And that's something that I'm going to ask you to do in this class. And then, of course, at the very end, then the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all our choices. It is understanding that the personal is political. Some of us have had the privilege of not having to be overly political because we've had privileges in our lives. Some of those privileges may be based on class, that if we've had enough money to get by, to have everything we not only need but also what we want, that means that we oftentimes don't have to think about those who are less fortunate than us. The same can be said about our gender or our race. There are those of us who've been subject to types of discrimination and others who have not. And if you have not ever had to have your abilities or your identity questioned based on race or sexuality or gender, then you're in a privileged position that we often have to reflect on and understand what that means for those who are questioned. So these are just a sort of few ideas that I pulled from both Baldwin and Lorde, and hopefully you also gain something from these readings.